What's worse than losing $35 billion in a divorce? For Jeff Bezos, the man who built Amazon into a trillion-dollar empire, the answer wasn't just about money. It was about control, about the image he had spent decades perfecting, and about realizing that the woman he rebuilt his life with carried secrets he never saw coming. The richest man alive thought he was finally back in command of his own story. He had turned the page, written himself into a new chapter, and at the center of it all was Lauren Sánchez, smiling by his side on red carpets, standing tall on luxury yachts, slipping on the engagement ring that symbolized his reinvention. On the surface, it looked flawless. It looked like the ultimate glow-up. But behind the shine, there were cracks. Cracks that didn't show up right away, cracks that only appeared when you looked closely, the kind that creep out later and change everything you thought you knew. Because this new chapter came with 3 secrets, 3 carefully hidden parts of Lauren's world. And once you hear them, you may never look at this couple the same way again. But before we get into the secrets, let's go back to the moment that made this new chapter possible: Jeff Bezos' divorce. In January 2019, the news exploded across the globe. Jeff Bezos and his wife of 25 years, Mackenzie Scott, were ending their marriage. The headlines didn't just focus on the split, they focused on the numbers. $35 billion? The largest divorce settlement in history. It was a figure so big it became a symbol. For the world, it was shocking. For Bezos, it was humiliating. Because this wasn't just a personal loss. It was public. Every newspaper, every late-night monologue, every finance blog ran the same story. The richest man in the world had been blindsided in his own home. The man who had built Amazon by thinking 10 steps ahead suddenly looked like he had lost control. And that was the part that stung the most. Control. Jeff Bezos wasn't just known for wealth. He was known for discipline. For decades, he had built his reputation as Mr. Precision. He moved through boardrooms like a machine, forecasting markets, anticipating risks, crushing competition. Every move was calculated. Every detail was planned. That image of the perfect strategist was central to his identity. And suddenly, overnight, the image cracked. The public wasn't just talking about his divorce. They were talking about leaked text messages, about tabloids running love affair stories, about private details spilling out into the open. The man who built his empire on privacy and foresight was caught in a scandal he couldn't control. For Bezos, rebuilding wasn't just about moving on romantically. It was about rewriting the narrative. He couldn't afford to be remembered as the billionaire who lost his edge. He needed to prove that he was still in charge, that he could take the chaos and turn it into a story of triumph. And that's where Lauren Sánchez entered the picture. Lauren was unlike anyone Bezos had ever been tied to before. She wasn't a quiet figure waiting in the background. She wasn't a business executive, an academic, or someone content to live off stage. Lauren was Hollywood. She was a television host, a helicopter pilot, a media insider who had moved through some of the most exclusive circles in entertainment. Where Bezos built rockets and logistics networks, Lauren built connections. She knew producers, directors, actors, and executives. She could walk onto a studio lot or into a Beverly Hills boardroom and belong instantly. For Bezos, who had spent decades locked inside the sterile corridors of Silicon Valley, Lauren represented something intoxicating: glamour, adventure, a world that wasn't just about spreadsheets and market shares. She brought him into a new kind of spotlight. Together, they were photographed on yachts off the coast of Spain. They walked red carpets at high-profile events. She introduced him to a media-savvy lifestyle that made him look less like a reclusive tech mogul and more like a modern-day tycoon. It was a reinvention carefully staged for the cameras. But behind the glow, there was tension. Because while Bezos was obsessed with control, Lauren's world was built on something very different: chaos. Hollywood thrived on it. The same industry that could crown you in one season could bury you in the next. And Lauren had lived inside that cycle for years. She knew how unpredictable it could be. She knew how fast reputations could collapse. And that was the part she worked hard to keep quiet. The insiders who watched her rise say she didn't volunteer every detail of her past when she stepped into Bezos' orbit. She didn't have to. By the time she was standing next to the richest man in the world, she had already polished her story, cleaned up the loose ends, and buried the details that could cause problems. But those details still existed. And they were tied to 3 secrets, 3 parts of her history that could collide with Bezos' obsession for control. That's where this story begins. With a billionaire desperate to protect his image, with a partner who had lived a life in an industry where image is never safe. And with 3 secrets that reveal just how fragile even the richest man in the world can be when the past refuses to stay buried. After the divorce dust settled, Jeff Bezos faced 2 paths. One was the quiet billionaire route, the kind where you disappear into private estates, fly under the radar, and live out the rest of your fortune in peace. The other was reinvention. Not just surviving the scandal, but transforming it into a comeback story. And if there's one thing Hollywood knows better than anyone, it's reinvention. Bezos chose reinvention. Suddenly, he wasn't just a businessman. He was a man in love. A man living boldly. The photos told the story first. There was Jeff on a yacht off the Mediterranean coast, shirt slightly unbuttoned, smiling in ways the public hadn't seen before. There was Jeff and Lauren at high-profile galas, whispering in each other's ears, laughing like a couple who had the world at their feet. For years, Bezos had been portrayed as robotic, even awkward. But now, standing next to Lauren Sánchez, he looked almost human, relatable. It was the glow-up era, and the press ate it up. Lauren wasn't content to stand in the background like a traditional billionaire's partner. She was front and center, and she knew how to play the cameras. Having worked in television, she understood framing, posture, and timing. She knew how to give the press just enough of a moment to capture without oversharing. And more importantly, she knew how to make Bezos look good. But who exactly was Lauren Sánchez? To understand the weight of her presence in Bezos' life, you have to understand the life she built before him. Lauren wasn't a passive figure plucked out of nowhere. She had spent decades climbing her way through Hollywood's tangled network of media and entertainment. She began as a TV host, the kind of personality who could carry an interview with charisma, quick responses, and a smile that made viewers lean in. She moved through news stations, morning shows, and entertainment programs, collecting connections at every stop. But she didn't stop at the anchor desk. Lauren had ambition that stretched beyond television. She became a licensed helicopter pilot, a rare move in Hollywood circles. Flying wasn't just a hobby for her, it was a business. She launched Black Ops Aviation, a company that specialized in aerial filming for blockbuster movies and commercials. That meant Lauren wasn't just mingling with celebrities on red carpets. She was working behind the scenes on multi-million-dollar productions, coordinating with directors, producers, and executives. Every flight, every set, every deal expanded her network. To the casual observer, she was living a dream. TV host, pilot, entrepreneur, insider. But to those who watched her closely, Lauren was strategic. She wasn't drifting. She was moving intentionally, weaving herself into circles of influence, the kind that could open doors most people never even knew existed. That's what made her presence in Bezos' life so striking. Here was the richest man in the world, a man obsessed with precision, pairing himself with a woman whose career had been built on the unpredictable world of Hollywood. To Bezos, Lauren represented everything he had never allowed himself: freedom, glamour, spontaneity. But for Lauren, Bezos represented something else: power on a scale even Hollywood couldn't match. Yet beneath the red carpet glow and the whirlwind romance, there was something else. Lauren's past wasn't just polished resumes and glossy magazine covers, it carried shadows. Connections to people who would later become household names for all the wrong reasons. Directors, producers, executives tied to scandals that rocked the industry. None of those scandals ever directly accused Lauren of wrongdoing. But that didn't matter. In Hollywood, just being photographed with the wrong person, just being seen at the wrong party, just having your name linked to a collapsing reputation could follow you years later. And that's where the cracks began to form. Because while Lauren's world thrived on relationships, Jeff's world thrived on control. And as their lives merged, insiders began to whisper that Bezos was realizing something he hadn't accounted for. The woman who helped him reinvent his image had lived a life full of connections that could come back to haunt them both. Lauren knew it too. That's why she worked so hard to manage her story. She didn't revisit certain circles once she aligned herself with Bezos. She didn't volunteer every detail of her past. She tightened the narrative, packaged it cleanly, and presented the version of herself that fit perfectly next to the richest man alive. But secrets, especially in Hollywood, rarely stay buried forever. The glow-up era was dazzling. It made headlines. It reshaped Bezos' image. But behind the glow, the first of Lauren's secrets was already waiting. Now here's where the story takes its sharpest turn. For months, the headlines painted Lauren Sánchez as the glamorous partner of Jeff Bezos. The yachts, the galas, the rings, it all looked like a billionaire's fairy tale. But behind those flashing cameras and luxury escapes, there was another story unfolding, a quieter one. A story not of gowns and glitter, but of accounts, projects, and financial moves made in silence. Because when Lauren entered Bezos' orbit, she didn't just step into the role of companion. She brought her own world with her, a world of investments, partnerships, and ventures that existed parallel to Bezos' empire. Some of those ventures carried her name. Others, according to insiders, were tucked under different names. And a few, the whispers suggest, stretched into offshore accounts. Nothing illegal on paper, no courtroom evidence, no smoking gun. But the nature of the setup raised eyebrows. Why? Because Jeff Bezos built his entire reputation on one thing: knowing everything. Every decimal point in Amazon's earnings, every fraction of a shipping margin, every single data point that could make or break the company. He was the ultimate overseer, the man who saw all, tracked all, controlled all. To discover that his partner, the woman photographed at his side, had projects he didn't fully know about, that wasn't just surprising, that was a power shift. Imagine being the pilot of a jet and suddenly realizing your co-pilot has been charting secret routes in the background. That's what it felt like for Bezos. For a man whose empire thrived on surveillance, oversight, and precision, the idea that someone under his own roof had financial pathways he couldn't map was more than unsettling. It was dangerous. And that is why some insiders call it the hidden money trail. Because it wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It didn't appear in glossy magazines or gala speeches. It was quiet, discreet, deliberate, spread out just far enough to stay beneath the radar, but close enough to matter. Bezos could buy rockets. He could buy yachts. He could even buy a Hollywood glow-up. But the one thing he could not buy was control over this. Because Lauren's independence wasn't about the money itself. It was about the freedom that money represented. It was about having a separate web of influence, assets, and connections that belonged to her and her alone. And for Jeff, that was the one crack in the foundation he could not seal. Control had always been his ultimate flex. Not the billions in his account, not the stock price of Amazon, not even the rockets breaking through the atmosphere. Control was the real prize. And suddenly he realized that Lauren had her own levers, tucked away behind the curtain, untouched and unseen by him. And just when this realization began to echo through whispers in his inner circle, something else happened. Something louder. Something public. Lauren disappeared. For a woman who had lived in headlines, whose image was splashed across tabloids and paparazzi shots on a near-weekly basis, the silence was deafening. No yacht photos. No gala appearances. No charity dinners with Bezos. It wasn't just a missed event here or there. It was a blackout. The woman who had once seemed inseparable from the richest man alive suddenly left the cameras with nothing to shoot. Whispers began to circulate. Had Bezos pulled the plug? Had there been a rift behind closed doors? Or had Lauren decided to step back and regroup on her own terms? Nobody knew for sure, and that vacuum of information only fueled the fire. In Hollywood, silence is never neutral. It always means something. When a figure vanishes from the spotlight, it's either because they're hiding, they're being hidden, or they're preparing for a comeback. And for Lauren, whose career had been built on managing visibility, the sudden blackout raised more questions than it answered. For Bezos, the optics were a problem. The glow-up era had been a carefully staged performance. It told the world he had bounced back from divorce. It told the world he was thriving. And Lauren was at the center of that performance. Without her, the illusion cracked. Behind the scenes, insiders speculated that the blackout wasn't just about image fatigue. It was about negotiation, about power, about two people with empires of their own trying to decide how much independence one could keep while standing beside the richest man alive. Because make no mistake, for Bezos, this wasn't about wealth. It was about narrative control. And for Lauren, it wasn't about needing his billions. It was about making sure her independence never disappeared into his shadow. That tension, the hidden money trail, the quiet independence, the sudden blackout, became the second major secret in their story. And it left one question echoing through every insider circle. Who really had the upper hand in this relationship? The richest man in the world, or the woman who had mastered the art of building power behind the scenes? Every empire has a weak point. For Jeff Bezos, that weak point was never money. It wasn't lawsuits, it wasn't competitors, it wasn't even regulators breathing down Amazon's neck. His true vulnerability was reputation, because reputation is what fueled his empire in the first place. Trust from investors, trust from customers, trust from governments that allowed his business to expand into every corner of daily life. And reputation is what he built his post-divorce comeback on too. The yachts, the red carpets, the reinvention. It wasn't just about love. It was about image, about proving that he was still untouchable. But here's the problem. When you tie your image to another person, their past becomes your present. And that's where the cracks began to widen. Lauren Sánchez wasn't a background figure pulled out of obscurity. She had lived a very public life long before Bezos entered the picture. She had mingled with some of the biggest names in Hollywood: directors, producers, studio heads, executives. At first glance, that was part of her charm. She wasn't intimidated by fame or fortune. She could walk into any room and belong. But look closer, and the names she had been tied to carried baggage. Baggage that could resurface at any moment. Some of those figures had fallen spectacularly. Scandals, public meltdowns, reputations destroyed overnight. And while Lauren herself was never accused of wrongdoing, the fact that she had been connected, photographed, partnered, or linked in business circles was enough to raise alarm bells. Because in the world Bezos came from, association was everything. In Silicon Valley, one bad headline could send stock prices tumbling. And suddenly, the richest man alive found himself with a partner whose past carried headlines he couldn't control. For Bezos, that was a nightmare. Imagine being a man who had built his entire empire on avoiding mistakes, on staying 3 moves ahead, on shielding yourself from scandal, only to realize that the woman by your side had spent years in a world where scandals were currency. That clash of worlds was more than cultural. It was existential. Bezos valued precision. Hollywood thrived on chaos. And Lauren had lived in the center of that chaos for decades. Insiders say this is why Lauren worked so hard to manage her story once she locked into Bezos' orbit. She didn't broadcast the old connections. She didn't revisit certain circles. She tightened her narrative, presenting only the polished, camera-ready version of herself. The helicopter pilot, the media entrepreneur, the glamorous partner. The rest, the names, the scandals, the associations, she kept buried. But here's the danger with buried stories. They don't stay buried, they wait. They sit in old photographs, in archived interviews, in deals long forgotten until someone decides to dig them up. And when you are standing next to the richest man in the world, people are always digging. That's the bombshell. It wasn't that Lauren had done anything illegal. It wasn't that she had crossed lines herself. It was that her past was dotted with landmines. Landmines that could explode without warning. And if they did, the blast radius wouldn't just hit her. It would hit Bezos too. For Lauren, managing those risks was about survival. For Bezos, discovering them was about betrayal of a different kind. Not betrayal of love, but betrayal of control. Because to him, not knowing was the ultimate sin. And this is why insiders whisper about the buried stories. The quiet parts of Lauren's past that never made it into glossy magazines. The connections scrubbed from her narrative. The associations edited out of the highlight reel. For Bezos, realizing that there were chapters of her life he had never read wasn't just unsettling. It was terrifying. Because when you're Jeff Bezos, secrets don't just belong to the person who holds them. Once they surface, they belong to the headlines, to the tabloids, to the public. And no amount of money, no fleet of lawyers, no yacht-sized distractions can fully contain them. That was the third and most dangerous secret. Not money, not even independence, but reputation. Because reputation was the one thing Bezos could not afford to lose. And Lauren's past, no matter how carefully buried, carried the risk of dragging both of them into the very chaos Bezos had spent his life avoiding. And so, as the glow-up era carried on, as the photos flashed, as the headlines celebrated their romance, a quieter story pulsed beneath the surface. The story of a billionaire who thought he was in control, and a partner whose buried past meant control was always an illusion. Did she step away for her own peace of mind? Or was it simply a moment of privacy in a life constantly under cameras and headlines? Because when someone that visible goes quiet, people don't just move on, they start asking questions. The most common theory wasn't about scandal, but about timing. That her absence connected to private matters, personal business, or responsibilities the public couldn't see. And Lauren, she has always been more than just a public figure on magazine covers. She has been present in business circles, at high-profile events, and in conversations that shape narratives far beyond the red carpet. That's why her quiet pause drew so much attention. In an industry where image is everything, sometimes silence speaks louder than words. For weeks, her absence wasn't just noted, it was discussed. Was she negotiating new opportunities? Choosing to step back from the spotlight? Or simply protecting her own boundaries? And for once, the story didn't seem to center on Jeff Bezos alone. It showed how Lauren could control attention in her own way, by deciding when to appear and when to step away. Because when the spotlight dims, it doesn't erase interest. It builds anticipation. And in that space, Lauren Sánchez shifted from being described only as a fiancé to being seen as someone with influence of her own. Every story has turning points, and for a moment, observers wondered if this was one of theirs. Here's the bigger picture. Bezos may have thought he was entering a new chapter with Lauren, one filled with glamorous photos and positive headlines. But beneath the surface, public perception doesn't always move in straight lines. 3 themes continue to follow this story. Her Hollywood career that keeps resurfacing, her financial independence that sparks questions, and her quiet absence that captured attention. Any one of these would be enough to keep the public curious. Together, they create a narrative that shows how even the most powerful people can't always control how their story is told. Because here's the truth, perception doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to how the public interprets the silence, the headlines, and the choices. And once curiosity takes hold, it spreads across boardrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms. So I'll leave you with this. Which part of Lauren's story do you think carries the most weight? Her Hollywood background? Her independent financial path? Or the quiet moments where she stepped back from the spotlight? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned. Because this story, it isn't over. It's only just beginning.